Hello, I'm Thomas Daigle with CBC News. We're live on Facebook and YouTube. We're going to be taking your questions for the next little while live online here about the suspected nerve agent targeted attack on Sergei and Yulia Skripal. Sergei Skripal is the former Russian double agent who is now based here in England, who it seems was targeted in this attack on Sunday. Metropolitan Police have in the past little while been giving an update on their investigation and for the first time have confirmed that this was an attack targeting these two people using a nerve agent. Police have not named any suspects and they are clearly still have a lot of work to do in their investigation, but that this is the most information we've gotten from them so far. Also, I should mention that police have said that there is a police officer in serious condition in hospital. This police officer in Salisbury, England, attended to this incident on Sunday where Sergei and Yulia Skripal were found unconscious on a bench in a shopping area. It seems likely now that that officer was also exposed to this nerve agent, and that's what landed that officer in hospital. Still recovering. Again, what police and public health are telling us is that officer is in serious condition. We're taking your questions on Facebook and also live on YouTube. And I'm going to take a first question here from Brian Brewster. Brian, thanks for your question. Brian asks, Sarin, was this Sarin? It's a good question. We've heard a lot about Sarin over the past couple of years because of the ongoing conflict in Syria. Police have not said what nerve agent they suspect was used. What has been reported here in London over the past perhaps 24 hours, I would say, is VX nerve agent was perhaps suspected here. Again, authorities not confirming that, but it is fresh in people's minds given that VX was used just a few months ago in the targeted attack on what seems to have been a targeted attack anyway, when two women smeared Kim Jong-un's half-brother with VX at Kuala Lumpur airport, and he of course later died. So that's sort of fresh in the minds of observers, and people are wondering if VX could have been used in this targeted attack. But again, authorities not confirming that, only saying that it was targeted. They are considering this now an attempted murder, while both members of the Skripal family, the father in his 60s and the daughter in her 30s, are still in serious condition in hospital. We're live, we're taking your questions. Thank you for those who are sending them in. Kate Donnelly asks, what nerve agent is this? We don't know yet. Police have not said. Some have speculated it might have been VX, perhaps even Sarin, but we just don't know at this point. And police also not saying, I should mention, not taking any public steps to identify that perhaps the Russians would have been behind this. They're not saying that. The Russian Foreign Ministry today saying that any attempt to tie this incident to Moscow is simply a way of ramping up anti-Russian sentiment here in Britain. That is the opinion from Moscow as investigators continue their work both here at Scotland Yard in London as well as on the ground in Salisbury in southwest England. Lise asks, are they all in serious condition? Yes, so the three victims at this point, the two targets of this attack as well as the police officer, are all in serious or critical condition in a hospital. They have been clinging to life since we first heard about this on Sunday, that two people had been found unconscious. It didn't get much media attention on Sunday, at least internationally, because it hadn't been reported at the time who was involved and what the bigger implications might be. By Monday, the British media started reporting the name of the man in his 60s who was found unconscious. Turned out he was a former double agent, one time a military intelligence officer, a colonel in the Russian armed forces. It turned out that he had helped MI6, or at least was alleged to have done that, helped MI6, passed on to the British spy service the names of British operatives here in Europe, sold that information, and that is why, at least in the Russian, according to the Russians, that's why he was found guilty of treason in a Moscow military court. That was years ago, I believe 2006, if I'm not mistaken. And then in 2010, Sergei Skripal came here to Britain as part of a spy swap between Russia and the United States. And that's how he ended up in England. Somehow, for some reason, his daughter was apparently visiting him on Sunday in Salisbury in southwest England, and that's when they were both the target of this attack using, we now know, a nerve agent, according to this update that we just got a short while ago from Metropolitan Police. Eric Zoe asked what happened. That, I think, just gave you sort of a layout of what happened there. The two Skripal members of the family were found on Sunday unconscious. Now we know that they were targeted in some sort of nerve agent attack. By whom? Police aren't saying. They are certainly not naming any suspects, if they have any. Mark comments, the UK and the United States have a long history and rivalry with Russia, as many others, maybe Ukraine as well, but Russia to cause at this time, it's just absurd. Thank you, Mark. It's an interesting point. A couple of reasons that I want to highlight here. First of all, this is a different case. Experts and observers have highlighted how this is different compared to, for instance, the case of Alexander Litvinenko, which I'll talk about in a second. But what happened here is Sergei Skripal was essentially pardoned by the Russian authorities as part of this spy swap. He was essentially freed in 2010, sent overseas as part of the spy swap between Russia and the United States, ended up here in Britain. So he officially, to put it in a certain way, had no beef anymore with the Russians, at least publicly. But what observers have said is we don't know what he had been up to and whether the Russians believed he has perhaps still been active with MI6, and did they have a reason, did anyone have a reason to target him now? Clearly that is still part of the line of inquiry for police now. Some have thought that perhaps this was tied to the recent dossier on Donald Trump, tied to Russian intelligence that was prepared by a former British spy here, Mr. Steele. And some say that Sergei Skripal and the British, a former British spy, would have crossed paths. They perhaps knew each other, and so was this payback? That's unclear. So much is unclear at this point, and the Russians keep pushing back on this. In fact, today the Russian embassy here in London tweeted, "Look, people don't know any information about what happened, but all of a sudden they're blaming the Russians, so back off." I mentioned Alexander Litvinenko. I just want to briefly highlight his case because I want to get to more questions here, but I just want to say briefly, many people have compared this case to that of Alexander Litvinenko in 2006, a former Russian spy who turned into an MI6 informant. He was killed here in London, not using a nerve agent, but radioactive polonium that was put in his cup of tea. He became very sick and he died, and it took an inquiry, I think about a decade later after this happened. The public inquiry found that the killing was likely approved by the Russian state, perhaps all the way up to Russian President Vladimir Putin. So enough about that. I'm sure we'll talk about that case and other cases again a little later in this live. But let's just go through a few questions here. Lise asks, could this be linked to Putin or the Trump election? I believe, just alluding to that a few seconds ago, there is an allegation that's circulating, again, not confirmed, but that this could have somehow been some sort of retaliation for the dossier on Donald Trump that was prepared by Christopher Steele, the former British spy. I think that's going 2 steps too far. We still don't know for sure whether the Russians were involved or not. Harmony Hiltz LeBlanc asked, what kind of damage is this causing? If you want to talk about diplomatic damage, for instance, the British Foreign Secretary just yesterday in the House of Commons, just up the street from where I'm standing, Boris Johnson saying, we don't know yet who was involved. We're not going to speculate on that, but essentially he did speculate, saying if the Russians were involved, whoever is involved, we're going to find a way to retaliate. And Boris Johnson speculating about potential new sanctions against Russia from the UK, even considering not sending dignitaries such as Prince William to soccer's World Cup that's coming up in Russia. These plans are not confirmed. I mean, would England even consider pulling out? I mean, I think, again, we're several steps away from this. We don't know whether the Russians were involved. Russia has pushed back very hard on any of those allegations, so we got to be very careful about what allegations we make. BJ Franklin asks, are you safe? Yes, I believe I'm safe. Actually, if I can get my colleague here, Jordan, just to give you a sense of what's going on behind me. We're just outside the location of New Scotland Yard, which is the Metropolitan Police headquarters on Victoria Embankment. You can see the media, the TV crews who are still sort of hanging out here. The update from police came a little earlier, and so we still got crews here just wrapping up, doing some live reports for their respective television networks as we speak to you live on YouTube and Facebook. Thank you for your questions. Going to take a few more here. Wendy Williams asks, is there a video of the attack so the perpetrator can be identified? First of all, I would say that police have not said whether or not there is any sort of video of what happened. Keep in mind, this was in Salisbury, which is a much smaller city than London. If I were to walk from here to the CBC office, or practically from here to my apartment here in London, I think I'd be caught on CCTV cameras pretty well the whole way home. London is among the most monitored, CCTV cities, if you will, in the world. And so if this were to happen in London, for instance, outside, it would have been perhaps caught on video. So this was in Salisbury, clearly not as many CCTV cameras in operation there. There is a video that emerged yesterday from CCTV outside a restaurant near the spot where Sergei and Yulia Skripal were found unconscious. There's a video where you see two people, a man and a woman, walking toward that location. We don't know for sure whether that was those two, but that is the only CCTV footage that has emerged so far. Harmony Hiltz LeBlanc asks, what kind of nerve damage symptoms have they exhibited, or is it known? No, police have not said what kind of damage or what kind of symptoms they've been suffering from. We know that both Sergei and Yulia Skripal, as well as a third person, a police officer, are all in serious condition in hospital after this attack on Sunday. That police officer attended to the scene, and it seems that's where they would have been exposed to this nerve agent, which still has not been identified by authorities, at least publicly. Neil R. McNeil asks, what would the Russians have to gain in doing this? Well, I would first say we don't know for sure whether the Russians were involved or were not. They have repeatedly pushed back since Monday, in terms of any involvement. But I would say that observers and experts, what they have told us in the past couple of days is it, in a sense, resembles operations that the Russians have carried out on foreign soil before. When you think back to the case of Alexander Litvinenko, the former Russian spy turned MI6 informant who was killed here in London using radioactive polonium in 2006. And I also think back to a quote from Russian President Vladimir Putin that has emerged over the past 24 hours. This is a quote from 2010 when Sergei Skripal was freed from prison in Russia as part of this spy swap with the United States. At the time, Putin, speaking about those who were freed from the Russian prison, he said these people are traitors and essentially promising revenge. Does that mean that Russia was necessarily involved in this attack some 8 years later? Assuming that is a big jump, but it is certainly something that has been highlighted as a potential reason why people think that the Russians could potentially have been involved here. Just to give you, again, just to reiterate what we've learned a short while earlier from New Scotland Yard here, the headquarters of Metropolitan Police. The Assistant Commissioner Mark Rowley came out to speak a little earlier and said a couple really interesting things about this investigation. First of all, confirming that a nerve agent had been used in what they're now considering a targeted attack, an attempted murder, targeting both these people, Sergei Skripal and his daughter, Yulia. And we also know now that a police officer who attended to that scene is also in hospital in serious condition. Taking your questions online, thanks so much to everybody who's been sending them in. Kate Donnelly asks, is Syria involved? We don't have any reason to sort of be drawn to draw that conclusion. We were talking about sarin earlier, sarin gas, which the Syrian regime of Bashar al-Assad is said to have used on its own people during the long ongoing civil war in that country. But I would say that has not been a major consideration among those who sort of study this sort of thing. Maria Marcus asks, how did he get in contact with the nerve agent? That's a good question that we don't know so far. Police not saying what nerve agent was used or how these two, Sergei Skripal and Yulia Skripal, may have come in contact with this nerve agent. If it turns out, for instance, to be VX nerve agent, people will be reminded of the case of the half-brother of North Korean leader Kim Jong-un. The half-brother was killed using nerve agent VX at Kuala Lumpur airport. What two women did is they were given or used some sort of paper or a cloth, I believe it was. They used something to smear the man's face with VX, and that is how we ended up being exposed to VX. Whether that was used in this case, I think according to the reporting here locally, what we believe is the Skripals had been having dinner at a nearby restaurant. Was this dropped in a drink or put in their food? I mean, there are any number of theories out there, but that restaurant where they're believed to have eaten, and as well as a pub in Salisbury, they've both been cordoned off, and police are asking members of the public, anyone who was in the center of Salisbury, to get in contact with them. It seems like police are getting desperate to hear any bit of information they can get from anyone who noticed anything, saw anything Sunday afternoon in the center of Salisbury where this occurred, because they're looking for any thread of information they can get as to who did this and how. Neil McNeil asks, what's the survival chance now that the doctors have found the cause of the illness? Police have not said. There was a representative from Public Health England who spoke with the assistant commissioner of Metropolitan Police a little earlier. Public Health England not saying how likely it is that these people will live. They're not putting any percentage on that. They will only say that all three people, the two targets of this attack, as well as the police officer, are all in serious or critical condition in hospital. Brian Brewster asks, if a radioactive substance was used, how could they have obtained this? Police are not saying publicly how they may have obtained this. They're simply not saying at this part. Cindy Rutherford says, be careful, journalists may be the next target if the persons responsible do not like the reporting. Well, thank you, Cindy. I appreciate your concern. We're pretty safe here, I think. Many people will be reminded of the television series that's on right now. It's called McMafia. Many people will sort of see the resemblances between the real story that's going on right now in that television series. But anyway, thank you for your concern. Tom Pearson asks, did the officer give mouth to mouth? Oh, that's actually an interesting theory. perhaps. We know that both Yulia Skripal and Sergei Skripal, her father, were both found unconscious. So were they breathing or not? That is unclear. Did this officer administer mouth to mouth, and is that perhaps how he or she came in contact with this nerve agent? It's a very good theory. It's possible. Police simply not going into that level of detail thus far. Neil R. McNeil asks, can you provide more on this spy's background? Yeah, I'll tell you this. So the man's name is Sergei Skripal, a man in his 60s, who was a Russian spy for the Russian military intelligence service. At one point he came in contact with MI6, it is alleged, Britain's spy service, and it is believed that he sold to MI6 details about Russian spies active in Europe. The Russians became aware of that, and he was eventually found guilty of treason in a Moscow military court, and he was eventually freed. About 4 years later, in 2010, he was freed as part of a prisoner swap. I believe 14 in all, 14 prisoners were swapped between Russia and the United States, and 2, I think, on the Russian side ended up here in Britain, among them Sergei Skripal. It is believed that he was retired. The question is, was he still active at all with MI6? Would the Russians have had any reason to target him lately? It's unclear. I should reiterate this because it bears repeating. We don't know yet whether the Russians were or were not involved, and Moscow has pushed back on any allegation that the Russian state was involved. Police have said that they're keeping an open mind, and they're still trying to figure out who was behind this, what they now call a targeted attack. I'm just going to have another look at my phone here for your questions. Just going to take another couple quick questions if they're coming in. My colleague Cheryl sharing the questions with me. Ati asks, if Russia is found culpable, what measures can Britain take against Russia, or is Britain powerless to do anything? It's a very good question. I mean, some cynical observers may say Britain has shown that it is powerless after previous instances where Russia is believed or is found to have been involved in the targeting of people on British soil. I believe it was BuzzFeed News published a list of 14 killings that were believed to have been linked to Russia, that British authorities ultimately didn't trace back to Russia. And you think back to the case in 2006 of Alexander Litvinenko, the former Russian spy, who was living here, who was killed with a radioactive substance in his cup of tea. The public inquiry that followed found that perhaps this went all the way up to Russian President Vladimir Putin, that he had likely approved the killing. Did Britain take forceful enough measures after that? Many would say no. But Britain's Foreign Secretary Boris Johnson has warned Russia and any other foreign state that could have been involved, telling them we will take measures to protect people on British soil. Some say this might be some sort of turning point where Britain says, look, this isn't happening anymore, given that this particular case is getting so much media coverage around the world. And whatever happened, it is embarrassing for the Russian spy service to have not protected its former double agent, and for him to have been killed in what now appears to be a targeted attack using nerve agent here in England. I'm gonna just give you one final update and wrap up here as we're live from London, just outside New Scotland Yard, the Metropolitan Police headquarters, just to give you, just to reiterate what the police have been saying. In this late breaking news this evening, London time, this afternoon, Eastern time, is that both these people who were found unconscious on Sunday on a bench in a shopping area in Salisbury, southwest England, Sergei and Yulia Skripal, that they were targeted in this attack. Police now treating this as a attempted murder. Up until now, the authorities weren't even saying with certainty that this was an attack or that a crime had been committed. Perhaps it had been some sort of accident, but now we know it was a attempted murder using a nerve agent. There is also a police officer in hospital in serious condition, police officer who attended to that scene and who would seem was exposed to the nerve agent as well. We'll, of course, continue to follow this story in the coming days on CBCNews.ca, on our social media platforms, and on radio and television as well. I'm Thomas Daigle. Thanks for joining me. Good night.